News headquarters in New York. This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite and Eric Severide in New York, George Herman in Washington, Leslie Stahl in Washington, Fred P. Graham in Atlanta, Peter Kalischer in Paris, Tom Fenton in Paris, Robert Shackney in Des Moines. And tonight, a CBS Evening News special report, the energy crisis.
Good evening. In a landmark ruling, the Supreme Court today legalized abortions. The majority in cases from Texas and Georgia said that the decision to end a pregnancy during the first 3 months belongs to the woman and her doctor, not the government. Thus, the anti-abortion laws of 46 states were rendered unconstitutional. More on this story from George Herman.
In 2 related cases and 8 separate opinions, the 9 justices made abortion largely a private matter and ordered the states to make no laws forbidding it, except possibly during the final months. The court split 7-2, with Justices Byron White and William Rehnquist dissenting. In effect, the court makes abortion subject only to the decision of the pregnant woman's doctor. It ruled that states may make no laws restricting a doctor's right to decide his patient needs an abortion and to carry out that abortion during the first 3 months of a pregnancy. After that comparatively safe 3-month period, abortions may be regulated, but not prohibited by state law and for the benefit of the mother's health alone. Abortion is somewhat more dangerous at this stage, and states may insist, for example, that they be performed in regulated hospitals. Only in the final stages of pregnancy may states intervene and say no to abortion. The court's decision, written by Justice Blackmun, thus sets limits on the right to abortion on demand. One limit is the time when doctors believe the fetus may be able to survive outside the mother's womb. At that point, usually in the 7th month of pregnancy, the state may take legal action to protect the unborn child, even forbidding abortion except to protect the mother. The newly liberalized abortion law brought immediate reaction.
I think that to raise the dignity of woman and give her freedom of choice in this area is an extraordinary event. And I think that January 22nd, 1973 would be an historic day.
In this instance, the Supreme Court has withdrawn protection for the human rights of unborn children, and it is teaching people that abortion is a rather innocuous procedure provided that there are proper legal safeguards. I think that the judgment of the court will do a great deal to tear down the respect previously accorded human life in our culture.
One of today's plaintiffs was an anonymous former mental patient identified only as Mary Doe, 22 years old. CBS News correspondent Fred Graham talked with her recently.
Now, the first 2 children you'd had they been taken away from you?
Yes, because I couldn't take care of them by myself, and I couldn't with my husband.
And then I believe you had 1 more, and it was also put out for adoption, wasn't it?
Yes, I put it out because of my husband.
Now, after you were unable to get the abortion for the 4th pregnancy, what happened?
Well, I had to go on and have the baby and have it adopted out.
New York State, among others, already have liberalized abortions. Now the rest of the country must follow suit. The White House offered no comment, but President Nixon has always strongly opposed liberalized abortion. Other opponents are now talking of a constitutional amendment to reverse today's ruling. Until then, if the experience of New York State is any guide, America will eventually have 1 abortion for every 2 births. George Herman, CBS News, Washington.
There was, of course, other reaction. Cardinal Cook, the Catholic Archbishop of New York, called the decision a shocking action, and Cardinal Crowell of Philadelphia termed it an unspeakable tragedy. The High Court also agreed today to resolve another major constitutional question, government aid to parochial and private schools. The New York and Pennsylvania cases to be heard involve various forms of aid, ranging from tuition grants and tuition reimbursements to tax credits and direct payments excuse me, for building maintenance. In other actions today, the Supreme Court, by an 8-1 decision, upheld a lower court order forbidding the anti-war priests, Philip and Daniel Berrigan, who are on parole, from visiting Hanoi. And by 5-3, the court upheld the power of the president to classify security documents without judicial review. The decision said the 1966 Freedom of Information Act was not intended to supersede this presidential right. The roads to peace converged in Paris today, the eve of what may be the final round of negotiations to end the war in Vietnam. North Vietnam's Le Duc Tho already was there, so was Madame Binh of the Viet Cong. And this evening, Peter Callister was on hand at Orly Field for the arrival of America's negotiator, Henry Kissinger.
I don't have anything to say. I'll just let you take a picture.
With Vietnam peace fever running high, transatlantic commuter Henry Kissinger arrived in Paris tonight to complete the text of an agreement, a job he begins and perhaps ends tomorrow with Hanoi's Le Duc Tho. This is where they will meet, in the conference room of the Hotel Majestic, at the same table around which those formal and sterile peace talks were held for 4 years. This will also be the scene of the final peace ceremonies, for which preparations were well underway when some camera-shy American officials dropped by to inspect. The agreement must first be initialed, then signed, and South Vietnam's Foreign Minister Lam, before landing in Paris, told CBS News correspondent Tom Fenton who would and how.
Well, the first step will be the initial. As you know, Dr. Kissinger already said that he would initial with the North Vietnamese expert if everything go right. And secondly, after a certain days, I cannot confirm yet how many days, and after some days, the parties concerned in the conference in Paris will sign.
Would you be permitted to sign on the same piece of paper that Madame Binh signed as foreign minister?
We cannot sign in any document where the GRP, or the government, provisional government of South Vietnam, where they are called like that.
Would there be some way to get around that by perhaps having 4 separate pieces of paper and each participant signing separately?
Yes, well, there are many ways to do to avoid those difficulties, and I think that the negotiators in Paris are keen enough to find a solution which make people happy.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm on the air right at the moment. Can you hold the line just a second? I'm talking to Tom Johnston, the press secretary for Lyndon Johnson, who has reported that the 36th President of the United States died this afternoon in an ambulance plane on the way to San Antonio, where he was taken after being stricken at his ranch, the LBJ Ranch in Johnson City, Texas. He was stricken at 3:40 p.m. Central Standard Time, 4:40 Eastern Standard Time. 3 agents who were at the scene, who are permanently attached to the ranch to protect the president, went to his immediate aid, gave him all emergency aid they could, put him in a plane, I suppose, Tom, one of the president's own planes. Colonel George Granahan was the man who proclaimed the president dead upon arrival at Brooke Army General Hospital at San Antonio. Mrs. Johnson was notified of the events at her office in Austin and flew immediately to San Antonio. And Tom Johnston, no relation, the president's news secretary, has just told me that from Austin. Any other details, Tom? All right, thank you very much, Tom, and we'll, of course, be keeping in touch with you. Thank you. Tom Johnson tells me from Austin that details, of course, are will be forthcoming. There are none yet for the funeral arrangements for President Johnson. Repeating, President Johnson, the 36th President of the United States, who served from the time of President Kennedy's assassination in 1963 until 1969, when President Nixon succeeded him, has died. He died of a heart attack. He had been suffering from a heart ailment for some time. He'd had two serious previous heart attacks, one as recently as a couple of months ago. He had been back at his ranch, though, and seemed to be in reasonably good health in recent weeks. He'd been up and around. He had not been bedridden in any way, and he was stricken this afternoon at 3:40 this afternoon. He died shortly thereafter, apparently, despite the best efforts of 3 Secret Service men at the scene who gave him every emergency aid they could. Well, returning to the peace story this afternoon, the peace that President Johnson tried unsuccessfully to get in Vietnam. Immediately after his arrival in Paris, the presidential aide, Henry Kissinger, went to the residence of the South Vietnamese foreign minister, and they conferred, the subject of their conference not immediately revealed. All the talk of peace today could not obscure the sounds of war, fierce fighting in a rubber plantation 40 miles northwest of Saigon. There the South Vietnamese, backed by heavy American airstrikes, claimed to have beaten back a North Vietnamese threat to Saigon. But Radio Hanoi insists it was the South Vietnamese who were badly shot up. The 2 battalions were decimated, 700 South Vietnamese killed or captured. And one wounded South Vietnamese commander in retreat seemed to bear that out, saying his unit fell apart. I'll be back in a minute with our report on the energy crisis. Because of the nature of the recent news, the news that came to us even as we were on the air here, that President Johnson is dead, we are foregoing that energy crisis series start tonight. It will begin tomorrow. A chartered Jordanian airliner carrying 202 Muslim pilgrims home from a visit to Mecca crashed on landing today at Kano Airport in Nigeria. Officials were not certain, but said the death toll was about 180. They said all survivors were severely burned. If the estimated death toll stands, it would make this the world's worst air disaster. Officials said the control tower at Kano warned the pilot of fog and poor visibility just before the crash. Former Attorney General John Mitchell and former White House aide Charles Colson have flatly denied a Time magazine report that they sanctioned the Watergate bugging. The magazine quoted Howard Hunt as telling this to 4 men and recruiting them for the operation. Hunt and the 4 have pleaded guilty. Meantime, in the courtroom, the government's star witness, ex-FBI agent Alfred Baldwin, ended his testimony, and Leslie Stahl reports.
Attorney Gerald Alch cross-examined Baldwin about his spying activities for defendant James McCord. Isn't it a fact that you thought what you were doing was legal? Baldwin said yes, admitting he thought that because he took his orders from the security chief of the president's re-election committee. At that point, Judge John Sirica dismissed the jury and began quizzing Baldwin himself. Weren't you suspicious when you were told to use an assumed name? Didn't that indicate to you some hanky-panky was going on? No, Your Honor. Sirica, who has repeatedly expressed an interest in whether any higher-ups were involved, asked Baldwin to what person at the re-election committee he had delivered logs of wiretapped conversations. I do not know. To whom did you give the envelope? The guard. Sirica, apparently disappointed with that, said, here you were, an FBI agent, knew this log was very important, and you want the court and the jury to believe you gave it to some guard whom you hardly knew? That was the procedure at the re-election committee. Leslie Stahl, CBS News, Washington.
General Motors today announced the recall of 3,700,000 1971 and 72 model cars. The auto company said it is recalling full-size Chevrolets, Buicks, Oldsmobiles, and Pontiacs to install a shield that will prevent stones from lodging in the steering mechanism. GM said reports showed this defect had led to 23 accidents, 12 of them involving injuries. Public school teachers are striking now in 3 major U.S. cities, St. Louis, Philadelphia, and Chicago. A majority of St. Louis teachers went out today, forcing the shutdown of many city schools, including 8 high schools. The Board of Education reported serious vandalism by students at 4 schools. In Philadelphia, where the teachers' strike entered its 3rd week, 2 top teachers union officials were ordered to stand trial immediately on contempt of court charges. They had refused to honor a court injunction ordering the teachers back to work. Averages were down substantially today on the New York Stock Exchange. The volume was 15,600,000 shares. The average price per share lost 23 cents on the New York Exchange, 7 cents on the American. As we told you earlier, former President Lyndon Baines Johnson, the 36th President of the United States, is dead at the age of 64. He died this afternoon in his private plane after being stricken by a heart attack. We now have a filmed obituary of former President Johnson.
Lyndon Johnson was a man of domestic vision and domestic triumphs, which were overtaken by distant events. He ended as a war president, trying to rally a nation to his own convictions. But it was a war without victory, and for many Americans, a war without heroes. His prestige was one of its casualties. Born to a tradition of politics, the personal style of the Texas courthouse, and sometimes roughhouse, his father and his grandfather were elected to the Texas legislature. But Lyndon was his mother's child. She taught him to read, mostly history. At 16, a hillbilly boy in a jalopy, he went looking for work in California. He came home to go to college on $75, borrowed money, and then spent a year teaching school to the second-class citizens of Texas, Mexican Americans. Later, they would vote for him. At 23, he went to Washington as secretary to a Texas congressman. A few years later, met a Texas college girl named Claudia Taylor. He called her Lady Bird. He married her within 2 months. In 1937, age 29, he barnstormed the state as a 100% New Deal candidate for Congress. He won with help from young people for whom he had found jobs as state director of the National Youth Administration, a Franklin D. Roosevelt appointee, and a Roosevelt protege. He was like a second daddy to me, Johnson later said. In World War II, he was the first member of Congress in uniform, served as a lieutenant commander, went back to Washington when FDR recalled all congressmen. Afterwards, he would seldom appear without his Silver Star decoration in his lapel. 1948, in Congress, a 6-term veteran with a reputation as a hard driver of himself and his staff. At home, a father of 2 young girls, a breadwinner making payments on a house, on furniture, on a car, talking about quitting politics and going into business. But that year instead, he raised his political stakes, ran for the Senate as a Truman Democrat against a conservative Democrat. Johnson won by 87 contested votes, earned the nickname Landslide Lyndon. And the Johnson career faltered in July 1955 when a massive heart attack nearly killed him. He retreated to the ranch he had bought near his rude birthplace. The family fortunes had begun to rise with Lady Bird's inheritance invested in an Austin radio station. Dominoes, an acquaintance once said, were his only sport, except for politics. By 1960, Lyndon Johnson was the most powerful man in the Senate, with a potent ally in the House. Speaker Sam Rayburn, his father's old friend, was promoting him as the Democrats' presidential candidate.
Johnson said he was interested in nothing less than first place, but the Kennedy men came better prepared, and in the end, he accepted second place.
I will faithfully discharge the duties
Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson, sworn in by his old Texas friend and mentor, Sam Rayburn.
The duties of the office on which I am about to enter, so help me God.
We were not like brothers, he once said about Jack Kennedy. We were not constant companions, but he sat in on cabinet meetings, on the National Security Council, headed the Space Council, and job programs for Negroes. But for the kingpin of the Senate, the vice presidency was a come-down. He said so in a conversation at the LBJ Ranch.
I think President Kennedy kept me as well informed as any president ever kept a vice president informed. I was disappointed at times. I missed the active role that I'd played. I think anyone that becomes vice president is disappointed, particularly if he's been an active man in public life, as they often are.
On November 22, 1963, in Dallas, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Aboard the plane on which his predecessor had arrived in Dallas 2 hours and 52 minutes before, Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as the 36th President of the United States. As the leader of a shocked and troubled nation, he addressed the Congress in special session.
I profoundly hope that the tragedy and the torment of these terrible days will bind us together in new fellowship, making us one people in our hour of sorrow. So let us here highly resolve that John Fitzgerald Kennedy did not live or die in vain.
He would never quite escape the Kennedy shadow, but he saw himself as Kennedy's trustee. I did everything I would want a man to do for my program or my family. And after I finished the dreams that he had, I started on my own, and I had some too.
The average American does not demand much, but we have a right to expect in this rich country. If we're willing to work from daylight to dark, we have a right to expect a job, to provide food for our families, a roof over their head, clothes for their body, an opportunity to have our children educated, and the right to worship God according to the dictates of our own conscience. And with your support, and with your help, and with your faith, and with your confidence, and with God's help, we will have it in America. Thank you.
Johnson called for a great society, and he got Medicare, a major civil rights bill, improvements in housing and education, building an imposing record of domestic legislation his first year in office.
The 64 convention was LBJ all the way, though he later told me he had strong doubts about running. He was dismayed by divisions in the country that he couldn't mend. He called this pressing the flesh. He seemed to get from this what some men get from solitude. This time, the landslide for Lyndon would be a real one. 61%, the largest ever. A mandate to pursue his own dreams as president in his own right. For a while, he seemed out from under the shadow. The 64 mandate turned loose the greatest flow of compassionate legislation in the history of the Republic. Johnson, the engineer, the sure hand at politics. This bill was to relieve the chronic depression in Appalachia.
Perhaps his greatest achievement was the 1965 Voting Rights Bill that put the weight of the federal government behind the franchise for black citizens in the South.
Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
From the domestic scene, in which his attempts at social reform were unparalleled since the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, the president was now increasingly forced to turn his attention to foreign affairs, a move that was to be both crucial and fateful for his administration.
Our objective is the independence of South Vietnam and its freedom from attack. We want nothing for ourselves, only that the people of South Vietnam be allowed to guide their own country in their own way.
But nothing he said could still the growing opposition to the war at home, and the communist Tet Offensive in 1968, though costly to the communist on the field, produced a decisive turn within America.
The voices just came out of the holes in the wall and said, let's get out. And that's what Ho Chi Minh had been trying to do all the time, was to win in Washington what he had won in Paris. To win in this country, in the homes of this country, what he could not win from the men out there that represented us. And it was only when the going got hard, and it was only when it took a lot of willpower to stand up, that he could win. And it was only when the going got hard, and it was only when it took a lot of willpower to stand up, that he could win. And it was only when the going got hard, and it was only when it took a lot of willpower to stand up, that he could win. And it was only when the going got hard, and it was only when it took a lot of willpower to stand up, that he could win. And it was only when the going got hard, and it was only when it took a lot of willpower to stand up, that he could win. And it was only when the going got hard, and it was only when it took a lot of willpower to stand up, that he could win. And it was only when the going got hard, and it was only when it took a lot of willpower to stand up, that he could win. And it was only when the going got hard, and it was only when it took a lot of willpower to stand up, that he could win. And it was only when the going got hard, and it was only when it took a lot of willpower to stand up, that he could win. And it was only when the going got hard, and it was only when it took a lot of willpower to stand Did we have much division on this war?
On March 31st, 1968, Lyndon Johnson dropped a political bombshell in a speech to the nation. First, he announced a unilateral halt to the bombing of 90% of North Vietnam. And then, his greatest surprise.
With American sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
So in 1969, President Johnson retired to his Texas ranch to take no further part in political affairs. CBS News will present a retrospective on Lyndon Johnson beginning at 10 o'clock Eastern Time tonight. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.